Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. I've been getting some requests to take a look at a video that Kings and Generals did recently, where they take a look at the reasons why Germany lost the First World War. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, the First World War, so I thought I'd dive into this one. Why did Germany lose World War I? Be interesting to see what Kings and Generals have to say. I have my own thoughts on this that I'm sure will be things that they will cover because they always do a fantastic job with their historical presentations. I want to thank Adam in Charleston, West Virginia, just down the road a few hours from me, for your support on Patreon. Could not do this without you. The link is in the description for this original video. Let's dive in.
Losing sides in wars tend to blame internal enemies, external interference, corrupt elites, inept politicians, and commanders in their defeat.
And that's an excellent point that he's making there, is that, you know, we make a lot of the stab in the back myth that developed after Germany's defeat in World War I, but it's not unique to nations for that kind of internal blame game to go on after a defeat. I think the reason that everybody's so aware and so fixated on this particular myth is because it led directly to the regime that caused World War II.
After all, one's glorious nation and its mighty army could not possibly have lost a war just because the other side was better prepared militarily and economically. There has to be a malevolent force which has orchestrated this outcome from the shadows.
I wouldn't say that other nations were better prepared than Germany. They just were more powerful than Germany. They had more industrial might, they had higher population. And I know we're saying just Germany, even though Germany had allies in Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire and others, but Germany really carried that war.
This process of cope happened to Germany after World War I, with the emergence of the stab-in-the-back myth, which blamed the defeat of the German Empire to Britain, France, and the United States on the communists
Russia
and Jewish people living among the Germans.
Well, I guess they didn't really lose to Russia. Russia fought the war, but Russia lost to Germany.
Played a significant part in the emergence of the Nazi regime in Germany, and another devastating global war. Naturally, this narrative was a false one. So why did Germany really lose World War I? In this video, we will examine the military, economic, and social factors that might help us answer that question. For a very long time after World War I, there was a consensus in German society that, although their country had lost the war, it was not because their army had been defeated on the battlefield. This mentality was embodied by Hitler and the Nazis, whose whole worldview stood on this premise. Yet even the first leader of the Weimar Republic, the Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert, shared this sentiment. "Keine Feind hat euch überwunden," he said to the returning German soldiers. "No enemy has vanquished you."
Yeah, and this was such a severe belief in Germany that you had some of the players in Germany's, we call it a armistice, but it was a surrender in all but name, in November of 1918. You actually have assassinations happening with civilian leadership that was involved in this. I mean, it was brutal.
However, as much as the Germans sought to insist upon the undefeated status of their armies, this claim is simply incorrect. While there are a myriad of complex reasons behind the German defeat in World War I, which we will examine in this video, the first and foremost cause of the loss was the situation on the battlefield. It must be remembered that Germany was fighting a war on two fronts. Initially against Russia in the east, and the combined French and British force in the west. The German strategy was based on the Schlieffen Plan, which, in hindsight, was extremely optimistic.
And it's important that he says it was based on the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was almost a decade old by the time of the war, and Schlieffen was gone, and you know, so it was based on that plan. Every country has war plans for different scenarios, and they had a war plan for a two-front war against Russia and France at the same time. And this was based on that. And in hindsight, it might have been better if they'd have done a reverse Schlieffen Plan and gone after Russia first.
It envisaged Russia taking at least 6 weeks to mobilize for a war against Germany, a calculation based on an extremely incompetent display of the Russian army during the Russo-Japanese War of 1905.
And based on the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71, in which Germany had very quickly defeated France. So both of these things are playing on their minds. But that's what you do. You base your strategy on what you think your enemy is capable of. And their enemies were not the enemies that they were basing this on. Russia in 1914 was not the Russia that was embarrassed in the Russo-Japanese War, and France in 1914 was not the France that got rolled in 1870.
Before Russia could raise its armies, Germany aimed to swiftly occupy the Netherlands and Belgium in order to avoid the heavily fortified French-German border. The German army would then enter France through Flanders, march directly on Paris, then envelop and destroy the French army. France was to be defeated in around 6 weeks.
And if that looks familiar, it's what they do in World War II. They do exactly that and do it successfully.
At which point the victorious German army would swiftly arrive on the East Front to face the mobilized Russian army. It is hard to understate how much had to go right in order for the Schlieffen Plan to work as intended for Germany. Indeed, many things in this plan were outside of the German control, which is never a good recipe for a successful strategy.
No plan survives contact with the enemy.
Russia completed its mobilization in just 12 days. In mid-August, Russians invaded East Prussia, forcing the German command to relocate some 100,000 men from the Western Front.
And the timing was horrible if you're the Germans, because they were getting toward the outskirts of Paris. The first battle of the Marne happens, and that really the turning point on the Western Front as far as stopping Germany from being able to achieve this quick victory. But then they go and defeat the Russians and basically wipe out an entire army at Tannenberg. And in hindsight, probably could have done better if they would have focused on Russia first.
Although the Russians were soundly defeated in the first battles on the Eastern Front, the German forces on the Western Front were now weakened. Belgium offered more resistance than expected, delaying the German advance into France by several weeks.
Yeah, and they didn't go through the Netherlands, despite what they showed in the plan. Netherlands stays neutral throughout the war. Belgium was offered a chance to basically stay neutral by the Kaiser, but the King of the Belgians said, absolutely not. You're not just marching your armies through our territory, and we're not going to stand by and just let that happen. So they put up a resistance. They lose almost their entire country in the process, but they do slow them down, and they bottle up their ability to move their armies. They bottle up their supplies, places like Liège, just long enough for the British to get into the war, which happened because of Belgium, not because of France. And the British didn't have much of an army at the beginning, but all of it serves to slow them down.
German violation of Belgian neutrality brought Britain into the war. Although the German advance into France was
And I know I'm really kind of a stickler for this stuff, but I wish we wouldn't show Great Britain as Ireland and Great Britain, because Great Britain is just the island that has Wales, Scotland, and England on it. Ireland is Ireland. It's the United Kingdom of Ireland and Great Britain.
Initially quite rapid, they were stopped in the First Battle of the Marne on September 1914. The result was an unbreakable stalemate and trench warfare on the Western Front. On September 9th, 1914, the German Chief of Staff von Moltke said that Germany had lost the war. Failure to gain a rapid victory on the Western Front now meant that Germany had to fight on two fronts.
Yeah, and much like Japan in World War II, Japan knew it could never win a long, extended conflict because they just didn't have the industrial capacity and the manpower that the United States could bring into a war. So they knew it had to be quick or they couldn't win. And the same thing's true here. Von Moltke knows that his uncle was the kind of the main German general behind the victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War, and he knew that we win this quick or we don't win this at all.
Which was a massive strain on its resources. When the war started, Germany was the leading producer of steel in the world. Early on in the war, Germany had the advantage of being the most industrialized country in Europe. However, Britain had the largest navy in the world, and used it to impose a naval blockade on Germany.
And that's the problem for Germany is, yes, they have this industrial might, but they rely heavily on imports. And this blockade, honestly, to me, is if we're going to talk about it, it's a multitude of factors, any situation is. And there are a lot of reasons why Germany lost this war. But if you're going to focus on one primary reason why Germany ends up losing the war, it's the naval blockade,
which harmed the German military production during the war immensely. Soon after the blockade started, Germany started experiencing shortages of resources vital for military production, including cordite, nitrate, camphor, saltpeter, and pyrites. When it became clear that this war was going to last, Germany transitioned to a wartime economy, prioritizing military expenses. They created the KRA, the War Raw Materials Department, to find solutions to the shortages and ensure steady military supplies. But this was done at the expense of civilians, which was going to bite the Germans back eventually. For a time, the wartime economy achieved its desired effect. For instance, in 1916, Germany produced 36 million shells, a fourfold increase from its 1915 production of 8.9 million. Had Germany faced only one, or perhaps even two of the Entente powers,
had the British stayed out of the war and not had their navy involved, I think Germany wins this war.
Might have succeeded, thanks to its powerful army and industrial capacity. However, the reality was that they were facing three major European powers, and their combined military and economic power was higher than Germany's. Germany's allies, on the other hand, were second-rate powers like the declining Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, and the newly independent Bulgaria. The total military expenditure of the Central Powers in World War I was $61.5 billion, less than half of the $147 billion the Entente spent.
And you can show the same kind of numbers when you come to industrial capacity and population and the size of the armies in the field. All of it favors the Entente.
We take the late arrival of the United States into consideration. And we should. Because the American involvement in the war was akin to a death sentence for the German Empire.
It's so important to point that out. I know that, especially our European friends, we love to kind of poke fun at the U.S. and how late the U.S. arrived in this war, but this was a significant factor. If you look at how Germany behaves in the spring of 1918 with their spring offensive, which is basically an all-or-nothing attempt to win the war, that happens because of the United States. Because the United States enters the war as the Russians exit the war. And Germany sees themselves with a small window where they can still win this thing because they know that every month you've got hundreds of thousands of American troops arriving on the Western Front. And their situation for the first time on the Western Front in 1918 are that they're outnumbered on the Western Front. That had never happened, and that happens because of the United States. I would not say the United States, France and the British and the Russians, they're the heavy lifters in World War I. But the United States involvement is not a tiny piece of why. It's a significant reason why Germany ends up losing this war.
Which was running on fumes by 1918. Germany attempted a blockade of its own against Britain, which was mostly carried out through German U-boats targeting merchant vessels supplying Britain.
People try to make the U-boat targeting of civilian vessels some kind of horrible thing done by the evil German Empire. It was really no different than the British blockade. It served the exact same purpose. The Germans saw it that way. They were targeting ships that had been warned not to enter this exclusion zone around Britain. Many of them, like the Lusitania, were carrying munitions and supplies for the war.
They managed to sink 5,000 merchant ships, but ultimately failed to stop the regular delivery of supplies. Instead, they angered Americans by sinking American merchant vessels and killing American citizens. This angered Washington, and the leaking of the secret diplomatic note of the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann was the final straw. In his letter to the German ambassador to Mexico, Zimmermann instructed the ambassador to persuade Mexico to declare war against the United States, promising military support to recognize the states of New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona as sovereign Mexican territory.
Little context here. Number one, the telegram gets intercepted by the British because at the beginning of the war, the German communications with North America had been cut. And so they were kind of piggybacking off of British communication lines, and the British were reading all of those. And they present this to the U.S. and said, look what we intercepted. And the Germans come out and say, yeah, we totally sent that. That was definitely our message that we sent. But also understand that at this time, Mexico has just gone through a civil war. The reason John Pershing is going to command the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I is because he had led what was called the Mexican Punitive Expedition. Because during this civil war that's going on, you have this bandit, Pancho Villa, who's raiding into the southern United States. And so guys like Pershing and George S. Patton are part of a force that are sent down to the border to kind of keep an eye on things. And so there's some tensions at the border. And this is all territory that has only been part of the United States going back to the 1840s, so 70 years at that point. Before that, it was Mexico.
British intelligence leaked this letter, and a month later, in April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. By the time the American Expeditionary Force started arriving, Russia was in disarray and practically out of the war.
Yep.
Germany could now focus on the Western Front. In hindsight, some argue that this was the point when Germany should have asked for diplomatic talks and achieved favorable terms from the Allies. Instead, Germany saw this as a moment when they needed to launch the decisive blow on the Entente.
It's part of this is the sunk cost fallacy. It's the idea that we have poured so many billions of dollars and millions of lives and all of our resources into this. We can't just accept what we would call a white peace. We can't just kind of accept terms. We need this war to have meant something, and so they're going to go all or nothing.
Particularly before the Americans were ready to attack them. Victories over Italy, Greece, and Serbia rejuvenated Germany's morale. As the German command prepared what General Ludendorff called the peace offensive on the Western Front, there was true hope that the Kaiser might emerge victorious from the Great War. Germany transferred 40 divisions from the Eastern Front and gained a numerical advantage for the first time since 1914. Britain
I'm not sure. I've seen conflicting numbers on that. I feel like the Germans have had the numerical advantage on the Western Front. Maybe they're looking at different sources than I do, or maybe I'm just remembering it wrong.
France had suffered massive casualties by then and were exhausted by the war too.
Yeah.
There was a mutiny in the French army in 1917. British units were understaffed after horrific losses suffered in the Passchendaele offensive.
Yeah, Passchendaele is the fall of, it goes into early November 1917. Devastating to gain 6 miles of ground for the British and Commonwealth forces. You know, the Australians, the men from New Zealand, or the Anzacs. They're very heavily involved in taking this. Canada, the British themselves, South Africa, and many others. The idea for this spring offensive for the Germans is, okay, Russia's out of the war. The U.S. is starting to arrive. We've got to deal with the French and the British. The French are powerful. Even though they are weak as far as their morale goes, and they are very weak. There's mutinies happening. It wouldn't take much in the German mind to knock France out of the war. So the way we do that is we don't go after the French army because they're much bigger. They hold probably 80% of the Western Front. We go after the British. So they're going to attack, kind of cut the British off cut the British and the Belgians off from France, force the British to negotiate, and then France will have no choice but to drop out.
On 21st of March 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael to start its decisive offensive. The goal was to split the British and French armies into two by capturing the Somme region. Germany carried out 4 other operations to break the Allied resistance. However, even though Germans gained further ground in these operations, France and Britain, now bolstered by American troops, prevented Germany from achieving decisive success.
And at this point, the Americans aren't an army of their own. That's not going to happen until late summer, early fall. Right now, the Americans, as they're arriving, are just being plugged in wherever they're needed. So division here, division there. They're going to fight at places like Cantigny, and they're going to fight at Chateau Thierry, which is Belleau Wood and the areas around Belleau Wood. Another battle of the Marne is going to happen.
Germany had now spent its last crucial military resources, including its stormtroopers from the Eastern Front, without much to show for it. In August, the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive. overwhelming the demoralized German troops.
So the Germans launched this series of offensives. They call it the Kaiserschlacht or the Spring Offensive. It's actually a number of offensives. The last one, I think, is in June of 1918. But they wipe out whatever energy and momentum they had left from bringing all those fresh divisions from the Eastern Front. And now they are at the weakest place they've been, and the Allies are at a really strong place with the arrival of these hundreds of thousands of American troops. And now this 100 Days offensive is meant to take back all of that ground.
In late September, the formidable Hindenburg Line was breached. German defenses were collapsing. Simultaneously, Germany's allies in Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey were exiting out of the war one by one due to military defeats or internal collapse. Germany was also facing an internal collapse, which we will talk about in a moment. In early October, Germany sued for peace, and a month later, the war ended.
Now, it's important to point out here that, talking about the stab in the back myth, by the end of September of 1918, you have the German high command telling the Kaiser, we can't win this war anymore. It just can't happen. We need to sue for peace, and we need to do it now. So this idea that the military was still capable of winning the war and they were stabbed in the back by the civilians, it's the opposite. It was the military command that was telling the government, including the civilian government, we can't win, send a peace delegation. So they send this peace delegation led by a civilian named Matthias Erzberger, who's the one that's going to be assassinated a couple years later. And they go to Campania, and Ferdinand Foch, who's the Allied commander-in-chief on the Western Front, meets them at the beginning, hands them a list of demands, and then leaves, and then gives them time to think about it. And they basically have to agree to all the demands. And the only one they don't agree to is the one they can't agree to, because one of them says you have to turn over X number of U-boats, and they're like, well, we don't even have that many U-boats to turn over. So that was really the only thing that got negotiated. It was basically a surrender.
It is clear that the situation on the battlefield forced Germany to end the war. But here the question is, how important was the United States' involvement in Germany's defeat?
Very.
This question is open to speculation. The deployment of American troops within French and British units during the final German offensive helped stabilize the situation and fend off the German attack. The American involvement in the Second Battle of the Marne was an important factor in stopping the German advance and the launch of the decisive Allied counteroffensive. Finally, the first major offensive of this final campaign was the Meuse-Argonne offensive, spearheaded by over 1 million American troops.
Largest offensive by the American military in its history, Meuse-Argonne offensive. Largest American military cemetery in Europe is the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. Half of all American battle deaths in the war happen in the 6 weeks of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Here's the thing, and I want to take a kind of a bigger picture of this. We're looking directly at the direct military involvement of the Americans, and on that count, yeah, there are some significant things, but really that's a minor point. As I said earlier, the major factor of why the American involvement in the war matters so much isn't the actual performance of the American military, it's the presence of the Americans in the war that changes how the Germans fight the war and changes how the Germans lose the war. So, as I said earlier, I don't think the Spring Offensive happens the way that it does, when it does, if it's not for the looming presence of American troops on the Western Front.
So, whether the exhausted French and British troops would have enough steam left to stop the German attack and then launch a counterattack is up to debate. Still, the very presence of the American army in Europe was perhaps sufficient for the German command to understand that any further fighting was futile. In that sense, the American involvement was the final major piece of the puzzle that made the German defeat inevitable.
Yep.
Of course, one should not overlook the morale problem in the German ranks. Obviously, any army fighting for 4 years without a clear prospect of victory is bound to have morale issues.
And a home front whose morale is in the toilet as well because they don't have supplies. Many people are starving. This blockade has devastated the home front.
The arrival of the American army arguably exacerbated this problem. From July 1918, the discipline in the German army started to deteriorate rather rapidly. Mutinies, desertions, and mass surrender became common. Up until July 1918, 327,000 Germans had surrendered in World War I. In August and September 1918 alone, 233,000 surrendered to the Allies. However, Germany's defeat in the First World War was not just about the situation on the battlefield. The Schlieffen Plan was designed to win the war fast, but after failing to do so, the war of attrition became the new reality. Here, the Entente, particularly Britain and France with their vast empires and resources, were better prepared for a long war. Moreover, even though the United States stayed neutral until 1917, they had much closer economic ties with the Allies during that time.
That's a great point, too. The U.S. was never economically neutral in the war. It was always, started out kind of trading with both sides, but really was economically supporting the Allies in a major way.
Up until 1917, Britain and France received $2.25 billion worth of loans from American banks, which was spent on buying military goods and food from the United States. To compare, Germany received only $27 million worth of loans. British naval superiority played a crucial role in Germany's defeat as well. The blockade imposed by them prevented Germany from trading with foreign nations and purchasing vital military and civilian goods. Early in the war, Germany started prioritizing military production, which inevitably caused shortages in other industries.
As I said at the beginning, the single most important factor in Germany losing that war, the naval blockade.
The mobilization of farmers and the prioritization of the use of fertilizers for military production all harmed food production. And in 1915, the German government imposed bread rationing. The poor harvest of 1915 caused further shortages. The failure of the potato crop, an important part of the German diet, exacerbated the situation.
They ended up having a situation where they basically kill all the pigs in the country, or most of them, because they can't feed them. And it also provides food for the country.
In 1916 to 17, Germans lived through the so-called turnip winter, as scarcely available potatoes and meat were now substituted by turnip for ordinary Germans.
Do not underestimate what this does to your war effort when your home population is facing starvation. Just think about what that would do to the psyche of your country. And you're trying to support the troops on the front, and all they're hearing is how horrible things. What are we fighting for? We're fighting for a starving populace. My family back home can't even put food on the table.
The food rationing by this year was growing harsher. Losses on the battlefield forced Germany to draft even skilled factory workers onto the front line and substitute them with unskilled labor, making German productivity worse. The lack of good news from the front and the increasingly desperate situation at home led to unrest. The first significant strike took place in Berlin in April 1916, in protest against the arrest of anti-war socialist leader Karl Liebknecht. Following the Russian February Revolution, the German strike movement grew as well. In April 1917, around 200,000 workers went on strike in Berlin, Leipzig, Stuttgart, and other major cities, demanding better working conditions and protesting food shortages. Demands to end the war started becoming more regular. The German strike movement peaked in January of 1918. Over 1 million German workers went on strike throughout the country, and one of their key demands was peace without annexations, the popular anti-war socialist slogan. The German government used the military to suppress this strike, but it was telling that the German socialists, who had supported the war in 1914, were now striking to end the war in such large numbers. The final nail in the coffin of the German Empire was the mutiny of sailors in Kiel. While peace talks had already started, the German Naval Command ordered its fleet to launch a final, desperate attack on the British Navy blockading the North Sea.
So, for years leading up to this war, there had been kind of a naval arms race between the British and the Germans. The Germans could never keep up, but they did have, by far, one of the most powerful navies in the world. And they brought it out really kind of one time in a major way. I mean, there had been naval fighting all over the world, but you have the Battle of Jutland right in this area here. And it really, Jutland resulted in it hurt the British more than it did the Germans, in terms of, if you look at the numbers of men who died, the number of ships that were lost and damaged. The British took it worse, but the British could absorb those losses more than the Germans could. And the Germans were like, oh, okay, that was dangerous. We're not risking our fleet again. And so they basically parked it for the rest of the war. And now they're like, okay, we're going to kind of go on like this kamikaze charge into a big final naval battle. And the Germans are like, forget that. We're not doing that.
In late October, the sailors refused these orders and staged a massive demonstration in Kiel on November the 3rd. These sparked a revolution throughout Germany, leading to the fall of the empire. But by then, the fate of the First World War had already been sealed. A month earlier, on October the 1st, General Ludendorff had asked Emperor Wilhelm II to seek truce with the Allies. The fall of the empire and the subsequent capitulation created this perception in Germany that, in fact, Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but lost due to betrayal by internal enemies.
Because that's what they saw. A lot of the people saw the internal strife that was happening and didn't realize that it was just a reflection of what was happening externally already.
Such as communists and Jews. This was the stab in the back myth, or Dolchstoßlegende in German. Particularly, it was the conservative and nationalist strata that propagated this narrative. However, even Republicans such as Friedrich Ebert, one of the founders of Weimar Germany, played their role in the entrenchment of this myth in the German psyche. This would eventually have disastrous consequences. It is true that the internal collapse played an important role in the German defeat. Food shortages, poor working conditions, lack of realistic prospects of victory, and the war fatigue all caused public unrest in Germany, culminating in the fall of the empire.
But it was all connected. It wasn't that the internal unrest was happening in a vacuum. It was happening as a direct result of what was happening on the battlefield.
However, the truth is that by the time all these factors were building up, the German army was already on the brink of collapse. Their main defensive line was breached. Fresh American troops were advancing, and German soldiers were surrendering en masse. Even if the revolution had not happened, the German army was on the verge of total defeat by the autumn of 1918. The war could have gone on for longer, but the result would have been the same. Otherwise,
and the result would have been the occupation of Germany and the war being brought to the home front and the destruction of many German cities and towns.
German military command would not seek negotiations. So, it is a myth that the German army was not defeated on the battlefield in World War I. They were. The combination of the American involvement, the German exhaustion both on the battlefield and at home, the British naval blockade, and the Entente advantage in the war of attrition led to Germany's defeat in World War I
100%.
And the fall of its empire. More videos on the First World
War. I agree with all of that. I think they did a great job of comprehensively presenting. It was no one factor, it was all of these things combined, and that's usually how it goes. It's never just one thing. So let me know your thoughts. What do you think about all that? Do you agree? Do you think there's something else that wasn't focused on enough or not mentioned at all? Do you think maybe we overemphasized something a little too much? Let me know in the comments section. Thanks for watching.